The last thing my father said to me, before he stopped being my father, was this: "You are throwing away everything this family has built, so you can play house with a man who lays floors for a living." He didn't raise his voice. Dr. Gerald Whitmore, head of cardiothoracic surgery at Toronto General Hospital, never raises his voice. He simply looked at me the way he looks at a chart that shows a poor prognosis, clinical, detached, already moving on, and he walked out of the room. I was 22 years old. I had just told him I was dropping out of my second year at Osgoode Hall Law School, and that I was moving in with my boyfriend Marcus, a flooring contractor from Brampton, who I had been dating for 14 months. My mother didn't walk out. She sat at the kitchen table in their Rosedale home, the one with the chef's kitchen, and the original crown molding, and the framed photo of my grandfather accepting an Order of Canada. And she said, very quietly, "If you do this, we are done. We will not watch you waste yourself. I want you to understand something before I go any further." I was not naive. I knew who my parents were. I had grown up watching my mother, Dr. Patricia Whitmore, manage a full cardiology practice, while also managing every social obligation, every school fundraiser, every appearance. I had grown up understanding that the Whitmore name carried weight in this city, that my grandfather had been a pioneering cardiac surgeon, that my uncle sat on the board of Mount Sinai. I understood the architecture of expectation I had been born into. I just didn't want to live inside it anymore. I had started at Osgoode because I was good at arguing, and because my parents had decided, sometime around my 15th birthday, that law was the appropriate compromise. I wasn't as naturally inclined toward medicine as my older brother David. Law was still prestigious. Law was still a profession they could announce at dinner parties without a pause. I met Marcus at a friend's backyard, gathering in the annex the summer before my second year. He was there because his crew had just finished renovating the host's basement, and she'd invited them to stay. He was quiet in a way that wasn't awkward, the kind of quiet that comes from not needing to perform. He asked me what I actually liked about law school, and when I said I wasn't sure I did, he didn't fill the silence with reassurance. He just nodded and said, "That's worth paying attention to." We talked for 3 hours that night. He drove me home in his truck, which still had sawdust on the dashboard, and I thought about that conversation for the next 2 weeks. By October, we were together. By January, I knew I was in trouble, not because of Marcus, but because of myself. I was sitting in a contracts lecture reading a book about interior design. I was spending weekends helping Marcus price jobs and sketch out floor layouts for clients. I was genuinely, embarrassingly happy doing something that had nothing to do with law. I should have told my parents sooner. I know that. Instead, I waited until March break, flew home to Toronto, sat down at that kitchen table, and told them both at once that I was withdrawing from Osgoode and that Marcus and I were moving in together, and that I thought I might want to train as an interior designer. My father said what he said. My mother said what she said. I drove back to Hamilton that night, and I didn't cry until I was past Oakville. Marcus held me for a long time in the parking lot of our apartment building. He didn't say my parents would come around. He didn't promise me anything except that he wasn't going anywhere. I want to tell you something about Marcus that the rest of this story will confirm, but I want to say it plainly right here, so there is no ambiguity. That man is the best person I have ever known. He had grown up in Brampton, the son of Jamaican-Canadian parents, who both worked in trades, his father in plumbing, his mother as an electrician. He had gone to Humber College for business, and then apprenticed in flooring installation because he loved the precision of it, the permanence of it, the way a well-laid floor changes everything about how a room feels. He ran his own small company by 26. He paid taxes, kept his books clean, called his mother every Sunday without fail. None of that mattered to my parents. What mattered was the truck and the sawdust and the fact that he had not attended a university that ranked. I enrolled in the interior design program at Ryerson. I still called it Ryerson then. This was before the rename. I worked part-time at a furniture showroom on King Street West. Marcus's company was growing, and I started helping him pitch to higher-end residential clients, bringing in design consultations as part of the package. We were building something, slowly, without anyone's help. My parents did not call. My brother David called once, in the first year, to tell me that my parents were very hurt and that I should consider the damage I was doing to the family. I thanked him for the message and did not return it. I heard from my aunt, my mother's younger sister, Carolyn, who lived in Vancouver and had always been somewhat allergic to the family mythology, that my mother had told people at the hospital that I was taking some time to travel. That detail, for some reason, was the one that stung the most. I graduated from the design program in 2 years. Marcus and I got engaged on a Tuesday evening in November, sitting on the floor of an apartment we were helping a client renovate, eating takeout Thai food because we'd worked through dinner. He pulled the ring out of his jacket pocket and said, "I've been carrying this around for 3 months, waiting for a romantic moment, and I think this might just be us." We got married the following April, at a small venue in Caledon, 26 people, all from his family and our friends. My side of the guest list had one name on it: my Aunt Carolyn, who flew in from Vancouver and cried through the entire ceremony. We built our life without apology. I started taking on my own design clients through referrals from Marcus's network. I had a particular eye for older homes, century houses, arts and crafts bungalows, the kind of Toronto stock that had been badly renovated in the 80s and needed someone who could see what it had originally been. I developed a reputation for heritage restoration work. I was careful, I was thorough, and I charged appropriately. By the time I was 28, I had a small but real design practice. By 30, I had been featured in Azure magazine, which is about as serious a credential as you get in Canadian design. The piece was titled "Restoring What Was Always There," and it included photos of a Parkdale Victorian I had brought back from the edge of demolition and a coach house in Unionville that a developer had wanted to tear down. Marcus's business had grown considerably as well. He had 6 full-time crew members and a contracts manager. We had bought a house in Leslieville, a semi-detached that we had renovated ourselves over 2 years, and that was, without any false modesty, extraordinary. We had a daughter, Sophie, born when I was 29, who was, by the time all of this began to unfold, nearly 3 years old, and entirely convinced that hammers and paint swatches were the most interesting objects in the world. She had Marcus's calm and, apparently, my stubbornness. I had not spoken to my parents in almost 8 years. I want to be clear that this was not a wound I walked around with every day. There were moments, Sophie's birth obviously, when I thought about my mother in ways I hadn't expected. Certain holidays, the day I signed the mortgage on our house, when the absence felt like a specific kind of cold. But I had stopped waiting for something to change. I had built a life that was whole. I wasn't performing okayness. I was actually okay. And then, in October, my Aunt Carolyn called me. She never called with bad news. She was the family member who called to send photos of her garden and recommend podcasts. So when I heard her voice, I knew something was off before she said anything. She told me that my father had been diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's disease approximately 18 months prior, that my parents had not told me because they didn't know how, and because they were proud, and because my mother had convinced herself that they would handle it within the family. That within the family had come to mean just the two of them and David, because David's wife had recently had twins, and David was, as my aunt put it, somewhat overwhelmed. She told me that my father's condition had progressed faster than expected, that he was still practicing, but modified, that the medication was expensive, and that a particular drug he'd been prescribed, one that had shown significant results in slowing his progression, was not fully covered under his private insurance plan and was running them approximately $2,200 a month out of pocket. "They're not destitute," Carolyn said carefully, "but they're burning through savings faster than expected. And your mother is exhausted. She won't ask you. She physically will not do it. So I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know, and because I think you'll want to make your own decision." I sat with that call for 3 days. I didn't tell Marcus right away, which I'm not proud of. I went through the full sequence: anger, then that particular grief that comes from feeling something for someone who hurt you, then a long stretch of sitting at my studio desk staring at nothing. On the 3rd evening I told Marcus. He listened to the whole thing. He asked a few quiet questions, then he said, "What do you want to do? Not what should you do. What do you want to do?" I said I didn't know yet. He said, "Okay, take the time." I called my mother on a Saturday morning in November. Sophie was at Marcus's parents' place for the day, so the house was quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, our kitchen table, the one Marcus and I had found at an estate sale in Whitby, and refinished together, and I dialed the number I had not dialed in 8 years. She picked up on the second ring. There was a silence that lasted maybe 4 seconds, and felt like much longer. "Lauren," she said. "Just my name." Her voice was different, not smaller exactly, but compressed, like something had been pressing on it for a long time. I told her I knew about my father. She didn't ask how. She said, "He didn't want to worry you." I almost said, "He didn't think he had a daughter anymore." I didn't say that. I said, "How is he actually doing?" She told me. In more detail than I expected, and with honesty I hadn't heard light from her before, maybe because she'd been holding it for 18 months, with no one to put it down with. The tremors were intermittent, but worsening. He had had to stop doing surgical procedures in June. He was still consulting, still teaching residents, but the identity of it, the part of himself that had always been most alive, was contracting, and he was not handling that gracefully. And she was managing both his disease and his grief, and her own fear, and she was very, very tired. I listened. I didn't offer anything yet. At the end she said, "I don't expect anything from you, Lauren. I know we don't have the right." I said, "I'll call you again next week," and I did. We talked 4 more times before she finally said what I had been waiting to hear. Not because I needed the apology to function, but because I needed to know whether she actually understood what had happened or whether she was reaching out because she had run out of other options. It came on a Tuesday evening, unexpectedly, in the middle of a conversation about my father's care schedule. She stopped mid-sentence and said, "I've thought about what we did to you for years. I told myself we were trying to protect you. I know that's not what it was. We were ashamed, and we took it out on you, and you were 22 years old. And you needed your parents, and we weren't there. I'm not asking you to forgive us. I just needed you to hear that I know." I didn't respond right away. I looked out the window at our backyard, which Marcus had landscaped the previous summer stone path, raised beds, the Japanese maple we'd planted when Sophie was born, which had turned completely red and was, at that exact moment, stunning against the gray November sky. "I hear you," I said finally. That was true. I did hear her. I wasn't ready to say more than that, and she didn't push. What happened over the next several months was not a reconciliation in any cinematic sense. It was slower and more awkward than that. I went to their house in Rosedale for the first time in 8 years on a Sunday in February. Marcus came with me. Sophie sat on my father's lap and explained to him in considerable detail that she had a cat named Brick, and that Brick was not allowed on the counter, but did it anyway. My father, who I had never once seen cry, not once in my entire childhood, cried. He held Sophie's small hand, and he wept. And my mother put her hand on his shoulder, and I looked at Marcus, and Marcus looked at me, and I understood that what I was witnessing was a man reconciling with the cost of his own choices, while also losing the parts of himself he'd built those choices around. I am not going to tell you it was easy. My father and I had one very difficult conversation in March, sitting in his study, while my mother took Sophie to the backyard, where he said he still didn't fully understand the path I had chosen, and I told him very calmly that I didn't need him to understand it. I needed him to accept that it was mine. There was a long silence, and he said, "You're right," 2 words. But he said them. My brother David came to a dinner at my parents' house in April. That was its own challenge. David had the particular defensiveness of someone who had stayed and was not sure he'd gotten credit for it. He was cool toward Marcus in a way that Marcus handled with such even grace that I almost felt sorry for David. Almost. Sophie, entirely unaware of any subtext, told David that his tie was the wrong color and moved on. There is one more thing I need to tell you about. In April, I got an email from a name I didn't recognize, a Thomas Element, writing from an address with an Australian domain. He explained that he was a social worker with a family reconciliation service in Brisbane, and that he was writing on behalf of a man who believed he might be my biological father and was hoping to make contact. I should explain. My parents had used a sperm donor. This had been disclosed to me when I was 16, in a conversation that was handled with the same emotional temperature as a discussion about insurance premiums. The donor had been anonymous under the rules of the time. I had thought about it occasionally over the years, and then mostly filed it away. I forwarded the email to my husband, and then I called Carolyn, who I had come to rely on as a kind of moral compass. I did not tell my parents for 2 weeks. The biological donor's name, I learned, was Peter. He was 61, he was Australian, and he had become eligible for contact under a change to donor anonymity laws. He had apparently been thinking about making contact for years. He was not ill. He did not need anything from me. He had, according to the social worker, simply wanted to know if I was okay, and to make himself available if I was ever curious about my genetic history. I want to be precise here, because I think this matters. I did not feel a sudden powerful connection to this information. I felt cautious. This was a stranger. Genetics is not the same as family. Marcus is Sophie's father in every way that counts. My parents, complicated and flawed as they are my parents. I exchanged a few emails with the social worker. I asked for a written summary of any significant medical history, which I received and reviewed with my own doctor. I sent back a brief letter saying I appreciated the outreach and that I was open to further contact in the future, on my timeline, and that I would be in touch when and if I was ready. I have not yet decided whether I will be. What I know is this: the decision is mine, not my parents', not anyone else's, mine. My father's condition will continue to progress. There will be harder seasons ahead, I know that, and so does he. What we have now is not a recovered version of what we never actually had. It's something new, which is less comfortable in some ways, and more honest in every way that matters. My practice is the best it has ever been. I am in the early stages of a project I'm genuinely proud of, a former textile factory in Hamilton that a community land trust is converting into affordable artist studios, and they brought me on to ensure the heritage elements of the building are honored rather than erased. It is exactly the kind of work I was meant to do. It has nothing to do with the Whitmore name and everything to do with who I am. Marcus still has sawdust on his dashboard. Sophie still narrates her entire life out loud. Our Japanese maple is going to be extraordinary again this fall. Last week, my mother called me not about my father's health, not about logistics, just to call. And she asked me about the Hamilton project, and she listened, actually listened, for 20 minutes, while I talked about load-bearing brick and heritage designation hearings and the politics of adaptive reuse. When I was done, she said, "You found your thing." I said, "Yeah, a long time ago." She said, "I know. I'm sorry it took us so long to see it. I don't know if my father and I will ever have the relationship that I needed when I was 22. I think that version of things is probably gone." But I showed up to his last cardiology lecture. He gave the keynote at a teaching session at the hospital, one of the last formal things he'll likely do in that capacity. And I sat in the back row, and when he finished and looked out at the room, he found my face, and he nodded. That was enough. Not everything, but enough. I'm not telling this story because I have a lesson to hand you. I'm telling it because for a long time I thought that choosing myself meant losing everything, and I needed someone to tell me that wasn't the only possible ending. My father chose his pride over his daughter for 8 years. My mother chose silence over honesty. I chose a man with sawdust on his dashboard and a heart that has never once let me down. The floors in our house are white oak, wide plank, laid perfectly. Marcus did them himself the first winter we lived there. Every single day I walk across them, and I think, this is what it looks like when someone builds something that lasts. That's the whole story. That's all of it.